So, welcome everybody to the 18th Auerbach lecture at Beit Emmanuel, and welcome to the members of the family and friends who are online. Can't see them. Are they there on the laptop? We can usually see them. So we have quite a full program tonight, which is going to end with the lecture and a couple of questions as well. And can I ask you to switch off your phones and then also to enjoy? So we're first going to ask Margaret to come up. Margaret is France's daughter, and over the past 18 years she's been through his writings and she's chosen 18 different ones, and tonight what she's going to do is read a poem that was written by Franz.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Good evening, Rabbi Chava. Right, okay. Good evening, Rabbi Chava, Board of Management, the distinguished speaker, where is he? Professor Harvard, there we are. Welcome. Congregants, friends. Once more, on behalf of the Auerbach family, our gratitude for honoring France's legacy with this annual lecture. These addresses have broadened our minds and horizons, and the wonderful people who have spoken on this platform over the years have challenged us, given us new ways of seeing, and brought together people with widely differing points of view. France would have loved that. It is also bittersweet this evening in that we have recently lost Mark Sandham, who has attended this lecture almost every year, and to whom, together with Alison Chisholm, our family owes a deep debt of gratitude for preserving, indexing, and archiving France's writing, and our condolences to Mark's family, some of whom are here this evening. You will hear more about Mark's work when Alison Chisholm pays tribute to him just now, to his memory and his work. This year has been so difficult. Social media has exploded into our living spaces in more ways than one. Responses to the events in Israel-Palestine challenge, test, and threaten the deepest friendships and the closest family ties in ways that I have never experienced in my life. I looked at various possible excerpts to read from France's writing, and in despair finally went into the garage, which is filled with shelves of boxes from extended family, as my close friends will attest to. I looked through one of France's boxes and found a file with some of his poetry labeled Future Scribbles. So, for a moment, I'm completely abandoning social media. This poem was definitely typed on France's old typewriter, and I don't think it was an electric one either. But perhaps poetry may be the best way to express our feelings about the terrible wounds that are being inflicted by us on our world and ultimately on ourselves at this point in time. These poems, contrary to France's usual love for dates, are undated, unfortunately, because it looks as if the poem I've chosen was written on an important day to mark a significant event, and it would be good to know what prompted its writing. In the poems, Franz speaks a lot of man and mankind, so I suspect it was written before the family feminists had a chance to exert our influence and wreak havoc with the traditional so-called generic he. Yet this poem comes from the heart, and if anything can save us from ourselves, it may just be the ability to listen to the still small voice of compassion, the silence that is at the center of all things, and the love that against all odds could change the world for the better at any given moment. France's poem is called dusk or dawn, question mark. And I think that is a threshold that we find ourselves at today. Dusk or dawn. Mankind, I speak to you, one voice from many million men. Man has learnt to use the atom's power. The atom has been split. One bomb was dropped. One town was hit. From the center for a mile all round, all shattered and burnt. One bomb was dropped. One town was hit. Not a life was found, all dead. You who have lived through bomb attacks, hear this. One single bomb was dropped. For 1 mile round, all life has stopped. Man has learned to use the atom's power. Free soul of man, now choose your way. Choose while you can. If you should fail before this urgent task, the race of man will vanish from the globe. Atomic power at last makes war a farce. Statesmen hear, mankind must know the end of fear. All power man has released, man must control. One world united, stretch from pole to pole. Mankind, I speak to you, one voice from many million men. This day will be the edge of a new dawn, if all men living and all children born remember this above all toil and strife. It is a crime to hurt a human soul. It is a crime to take a human life.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so much, Margaret. Can you hear? Yes, okay. So now I'm just going to invite Alison Chisholm, who's a former librarian at the Wits Education Library, is going to give a short tribute to her colleague Mark Sandham. And her tribute will explain the connection to France.
Thank you. I think you can use this one. There you go.
It'll be all right
Very
if I sit
close.
down.
Very close, okay.
Greetings to Mark's family that are watching us online, to his family and friends too. And thank you, Margaret, for giving me this opportunity to talk on this occasion. I would like to talk about the background to the Franz Auerbach archive. Mark Sandham was the head of the Wits Education Library from 2002 to end of 2019. A man who was instrumental in making this happen because he understood the importance of preserving France's contribution to education. Mark's bibliography and commentary, leading educationist Dr. Franz Auerbach, took root in 2005 and was published in 2008. Noreen Auerbach had collected newspaper clippings and articles by and on France from 1950 to 2004. It was a labor of love to preserve and safeguard this precious archive. At our first meeting with Noreen in 2005 to discuss the Franz Auerbach archive, she gave us several Lever Archer files to look at. This archive was in impeccable order. Because of Mark's warm smile, professionalism, overall courteous and polite manner, Noreen trusted Mark to take the project further, as he saw fit. She even gave Mark her precious diary and record of materials. Mark then assiduously compiled an annotated bibliography, which provides a key and an invaluable resource for anyone wanting to write up and on the intellectual history of France's contribution in the education of South Africa. Mark gives an organized sense of the scope of France's body of work in this bibliography. This is a meticulously researched and produced bibliography by a well-loved, respected, and outstanding scholarly librarian, who is a great loss to Wits and to the larger education community. The archive is currently housed at the Wits Historical Papers in the William Cullen Library, should you need to look at it. And then lastly, the Franz Auerbach archive is a fitting tribute to France's legacy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alison. Our new rabbi, Chava Costa, will lead us in saying the Kaddish for Franz. For not only for Franz, for his wife Noreen, for their son Ronald, for Margaret's wife Liba, for Mark Sandham, and all those civilians who have been killed in the past 407 days in Israel, in Gaza, the West Bank, and in Lebanon. We can only imagine that this is what Franz would have wanted. So please, can you stand?
If you know it, join in. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, וילמד יברח יותר וימליך מלכותה, וחייכון וברכון וחיילכו בית ישראל, בעגלה בזמן קריב אמרו, יהא שמי רבה ברך עולם על מיה, יברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתייסר, יתגדל ויתהלל יתהלל שמי דקודשה, לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה, ואמירן ועלמה ואמרו אמן. יהא שלמה רבה משמי החיים, עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום מרומה והוא יעשה שלום, עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל בני אדם ואמרו אמן.
Thank you, Rabbi Chava. So now we get to the main part of our evening, and that is we're going to invite Professor Anton Harbour to speak, and Dr. Paul Davis, who's our chairperson, is going to introduce him.
Good evening all.
Good evening.
Lovely to see you all here tonight. Welcome to Beit Emmanuel and to this very important public lecture. Public lecture, I thought I was shouting loudly.
Closer. Closer.
Closer.
Otherwise on Zoom they can't hear you.
Professor Anton Harbour is a perfect choice to deliver this 18th France Auerbach Interfaith lecture. It is an honor to introduce him to you as we continue the proud tradition of celebrating the values of education, intellectual rigor, and critical engagement that Franz Auerbach so passionately championed. He, Franz, was a prolific letter writer to the editors. Professor Anton Harbour is a luminary in the field of journalism, media studies, and the fight for freedom of expression. Let me highlight some of his contributions. Anton studied at the University of Witwatersrand, where his connection with journalism began. He co-founded the Weekly Mail, later known as the Mail and Guardian, in 1985, a publication that played a critical role during the South Africa's apartheid era by fearlessly exposing injustices and giving voice to the marginalized. Professor Harbour's contributions go far beyond newsrooms. He served as the editor-in-chief of ENCA, founded Big Media, a pioneering internet company, and is the driving force behind the African Investigative Journalism Conference, which brings together journalists from across Africa. Currently a professor at Wits University, he holds the Caxton Chair of Journalism and serves as an executive director of the Campaign for Free Expression, an organization dedicated to defending and enabling free expression throughout Southern Africa. His scholarly contributions include seminal work such as Dipsloot in 2011 and So for the Record, Behind the Headlines in an Era of State Capture in 2020, both of which underscore his deep commitment in truth-telling in turbulent times. He's also the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the Missouri Medal of Honor and the Pringle Award for Press Freedom. Professor Harber's professional achievements are matched by his role as an advocate for investigative journalism and ethical reporting. Through the initiatives like the Henry Ngumalo Foundation, he supports investigative journalists in their mission to hold power to account. This evening, Professor Harber, I think, will delve into a topic that is both timely and thought-provoking. A man of letters in a time of social media is the title he gave. In a world dominated by the rapid pace and fleeting nature of digital communication, what does it mean to remain anchored in the traditions of thoughtful writing and nuanced discourse? How do we balance the enduring value of the written word with the transformative and at times deliberately dissembling and often chaotic power of social media? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the extraordinary Professor Anton Harber as he shares his insight into this fascinating intersection of the timeless and the contemporary. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul, for those very generous words and that long introduction. Just kind of you. Oh, okay. I was saying thank you to Paul for that introduction. Thank you to the rabbi and the shul for the evening, to the Auerbach family, to Margaret in particular, and Jessica for the invitation, which came some months ago. If it came today, I might have thought twice. But it is indeed an honor to be speaking at an event named for Franz Auerbach, who I knew from the days he was frequently in newspaper offices, delivering articles and letters. In preparation for this talk, I've taken a look through some of Franz's writings in the course of a long and full life and career in education. To read them all contained in the boxes you have heard about, 7 large boxes in Witz's historical archives, would be a formidable feat. So I have just sampled them. Most striking in those letters is the simple, plain-speaking language he used in all of his writing. No fancy flourishes, few multi-syllable words, just carefully structured, meticulously argued pieces that are clear, to the point, and an absolute pleasure to read. A model of effective writing. Looking through them, I was reminded of the man who wrote this. In a peaceful age, I might have written ornate or merely descriptive books, and might have remained almost unaware of my political loyalties. As it is, I forced to become a pamphleteer. That, of course, was George Orwell in Why I Write, he being another model for such plain writing. Orwell also said, "It is invariably where I lacked a political purpose that I wrote lifeless books and was betrayed into purple passages, sentences without meaning, decorative adjectives, and humbug generally. All of the writing I've seen from France had political purpose. He wrote about bias in school history books, the iniquities of Bantu education and racial segregation, and discrimination generally. He shared not just Orwell's skill with frank and clear writing and his use of pseudonyms, but his consistent sense of moral purpose over a lifetime. And France did it from a distinctly Jewish perspective. 1976, he said this in a way that is most pertinent today. Those who are aware of medieval ghettos, of passport-stamped Juda, and yellow stars on jackets, have the moral obligation to oppose racial discrimination. This I must oppose because I am a Jew. Just as an aside, he writes in his autobiography of arriving as a young refugee from Germany, his family having very little and his parents having to take up manual, low-paid work of the sort typically done by migrants. His mother was a dentist who became a machinist in a clothing factory. His father was an engineer who became a door-to-door hawker. These are the car guards or scooter deliverers of Joburg today. And they face the same hostility towards new migrants that we know so well today. It's not my intention today to talk about France. But his lifelong engagement through writing with social and political issues, and the consistency and clarity with which he did it, is a useful segue into what I do want to talk about: public discourse in an age shaped by social media. What a contrast. France typing out carefully constructed and thought through arguments, which in those days had to be delivered by hand to the newspaper for it to run a day or two later at best. Now public debate is shaped by social media, and mostly it is fragmented, abrupt, rude, consists largely of assertions, sideswipes, and shout-outs, not to speak of how it is unfiltered, riddled with disinformation, often stooping to harassment and abuse. France would have struggled to be heard in the cacophony of social media, which favors material that is provocative, aggressive, and conflictual over careful argument and delicate wording. Of course, one must say, social media has opened up public discourse wonderfully, making it easier for everyone to participate in public exchanges and to be heard, though we still have a digital divide in this part of the world. It has proved to be a most powerful weapon in the hands of those fighting tyranny and oppression, exposing wrongdoing and mobilizing against it, whether it was during the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too campaign, the plight of the Uyghur in China, Alexei Navalny's campaign against President Putin. I could give a long string of examples of social media being used in campaigns of that sort. Around the world, citizens have used the digital space to rise against authoritarian regimes, advocate for change in democracies. And this is often forgotten in the anger about disinformation and hate speech on these platforms, and the clamor this has brought for laws and regulations to contain them. I think this is because we often mischaracterize the problem. Social media has opened up our discourse, but it has not democratized it, as was originally hoped. In the utopian early days of the internet, John Perry Barlow wrote A Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, a seminal document, where he said, "We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence and conformity." How quickly that optimism was quashed. We learned over time that the internet was brilliantly constructed to make it hard for governments to control. Not impossible, as the Chinese have shown us, but extremely difficult. What emerged, though, were a few dominant platforms under the control of a small set of plutocrats, billionaires with absolute control over the secret algorithms that determined what information we received and consumed. Never before had we seen so few with so much global power. Google with 92% of the world's searches. Its nearest rival, China's Baidu engine, has a mere 3.5%. Google doesn't need to compete anymore, to be innovative anymore, as it can use its cash pile of about $90 billion to buy an average of a company a week, either a potential competitor or a company with some bit of new technology that Google wants to own. Facebook has over 3 billion active users, but if you add in its sister apps, WhatsApp, Instagram, you get over 7 billion. Although, of course, there's overlap between them. I can throw out plenty of numbers, but what is significant is that most of these companies are controlled by one man. And never has so few men had so much capacity to control what information the world is receiving or not receiving. It's hard to see the internet as a paragon of free speech when this is the case. We thought that the internet would bring a world with fewer gatekeepers. And it is a world with fewer gatekeepers, but we didn't realize just how few and how powerful they would be. They are the ones who decide whether to boost or play down what is happening in Gaza, or what happened on October the 7th. Whether to promote the words of Putin or Navalny. Whether to boost Xi Jinping on one hand, or the Uyghur people on the other. Whether to favor Jacob Zuma or Cyril Ramaphosa. Or whether to play down news altogether, as Facebook is now doing. They are also able to collect an extraordinary and frightening amount of data about each one of us. Knowing more about us than we ourselves know, and doing it seemingly without restriction or restraint. The Nobel Prize-winning journalist, the remarkable Maria Ressa, is in Joburg this week. So I've been engaged in discussion about these issues intensely for this week. She's been speaking eloquently and passionately about how the manipulation of these platforms is distorting and undermining our democracies. But I find it interesting that her own example captures the ambivalent, even contradictory, relationship that we journalists have with this technology. We warn of the dangers, yet revel in how wonderful and powerful a tool it is for journalists and the reach it gives us. She herself makes full and unbridled use of it, just as she warns of the harm it is doing to herself and all of us. I saw it once in a training session I attended, where the first half of the training was showing journalists how to use social media to track down and learn about the people they were investigating. The second half was devoted to telling journalists how to prevent others from using this tool against them. But it is worth remembering that every new media technology has brought a panic, an elite panic, a fear that it will spread dangerous disinformation, undermine the status quo unless controlled from above. Parents have become aware of a puzzling change in the behavior patterns of their children, said the American Psychological Association. They cannot lock out this intruder because it has an invincible hold on their children. Sound familiar? It was written in 1936. And now we're talking about the radio. A major newspaper wrote about new media technology as, quote, one of the most serious, unreported, disabling, antisocial diseases today. That was in 1984. and they were talking about the landline telephone. So there was a panic about the impact of printing, radio, television, video games, internet, and now social media. Television was often compared to a narcotic, as were at different times novels, comic books, computer games, and videos. But with the internet, the panic is particularly acute because disinformation and hate speech spread so fast, so wide, and so perniciously in this new medium. There are close parallels, writes free speech historian Jacob Mchangama, between the modern democratic elite's mistrust of social media and the nervousness that privileged classes have displayed time and again when the masses gain access to potentially radical ideas. The reasons and the language now used, he says, sound similar to the reasons given by William Pitt for his clampdown in the 18th century on printing presses in England. And America's Sedition Act of 1798, which promised severe penalties for anyone using a printing press improperly. The panic follows a regular pattern. First, there is unbridled hope in a new technology, then a period of disillusionment and abuse, which often leads to attempts to control and over-control, even suppress. And then over time, society learns how to manage these technologies. They are, after all, just tools that can be used for good or bad, and almost always are used for both. And as we worked out how to use each new technology, we learned time and again that the value of open information and discussion of free speech outweighed its abuse. Essentially how we did it, how we integrated each of these technologies into society, was by making those who published or broadcast take responsibility for their content. The editor, the owner, the publisher, the licensee, they were held legally responsible if they carried material that was dangerous. It was that simple. And to alleviate that burden, we often developed self-regulatory systems, as with our own press council or broadcast complaints commission in this country. Let's rather police ourselves, we said, than give politicians the power to do so, because they almost inevitably get it wrong and abuse it. A critical difference with the internet, though, was that the US did just the opposite, and they did it preemptively. In 1996, under the Clinton administration, when there were only 40 million internet users, they passed something called Section 230 of their Communications Act. It's a little known law, but that law said that platform owners could not be held responsible for third-party content. They argued at the time that this would allow the unfettered growth of the internet, and it certainly did. But it also meant that the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk can't be held accountable in the US for how they wield their extraordinary powers. This is the root issue. This is the fundamental cause of the problem of the unbridled spread of harmful information on social media. And how we are seeing now the way these billionaires use those powers. Elon Musk to promote his personal financial and political interests. He may be losing on X users and advertisers, but his extraordinary wealth makes him immune from normal market forces. What he can make by using his platform to gain political influence outweighs the cost of his contempt for audience and advertisers. We see Mark Zuckerberg in his determination to maximize audience engagement, seemingly unconcerned by the personal harm and social conflict and division he is causing. Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen told us how Facebook knew the harm they were causing to young people, but they buried the information, choosing profit over the safety of their audience. A critical factor is that these platforms work behind a veil of secrecy, so that it's hard to know how they are exercising their power through their algorithms. My organization, the Campaign for Free Expression, pushed 4 of the major platforms to share with us what they were doing to prevent digital disruption of our elections in May this year. We asked questions like, if you are monitoring election disinformation, are you doing it in all our languages, or are you letting other languages slip through? Are you monitoring for harassment of journalists or election commissioners? This is stuff we need to know if we are going to defend the integrity of our elections. Their response was to dismiss us with contempt, saying that this country's freedom of information laws had no jurisdiction over them, and they did not have to comply, even though they have officers and staff here in Johannesburg. To be fair though, one needs to differentiate between the platforms. Some, like Facebook, WhatsApp and TikTok, have, under political pressure, increased their monitoring of what they call their community standards and set up a self-regulatory system, including an independent oversight board. While we all know that X has gone the other way, actively and purposefully promoting disinformation and conspiracy theories. But what we've learned from Facebook's attempts to do it is how impossible it is to do it properly. It is too large a task for humans and too complex a task for artificial intelligence robots. There are 4.5 billion posts a day, on Facebook. And in 2018, for example, Facebook reported that it was taking down 9 million a day and closing 6 million fake accounts every day. 97% of these takedowns, or maybe we shouldn't use their euphemism, call it what it is, acts of censorship, were identified by artificial intelligence. And we know that AI has difficulty in judging nuance, context, sarcasm, irony, and all the things that can give very different meaning to the same words and pictures and similar posts. We know AI has learnt and absorbed human bias and prejudice. And if you look on the website at the rulings of their oversight board, you will see how complex these decisions are. Should they follow local law? When local law is often pretty bad. We would want them to follow local law on the use of the South African flag. But would we want them to follow Ugandan law on what you can say about the LGBTQ community? So they grapple with very tough and impossible questions. Not impossible, but tough. Facebook admits to roughly 10% error rate in this censorship, which is a huge amount of free and legitimate speech disappearing from the digital world. Never has there been an institution who can exert such control over what is being said, read, and shared around the world. We can cite many ridiculous, mistaken takedowns, such as Bob Dylan's song Neighborhood Bully, when AI picked up the word bully. And some tragic ones, such as when it took down the sites of 60 Tunisian bloggers and activists. The technology might improve, and probably will, but for now, it is seriously flawed. As a result of this kind of self-monitoring and self-censorship, the platform Telegram has become the go-to place for human traffickers and others who want to operate out of sight from the law. But in the same contradictory way, journalists and activists also use it because it is more secure. So one should not downplay the value of having a secure communications platform which governments can't easily access. When governments insist on platforms giving it access to their data, they might use it to go after criminals but they also use it in many places to go after journalists and activists. So the US has given social media owners immunity. The Canadians, the Europeans, the Australians, the Brazilians and others are trying to call into account for their content. That is why the arrest a couple of months ago of the Telegram CEO, Pavel Durov, in France, for not doing enough allegedly to stop the criminal use of his platform was so significant. And why it is noteworthy that our President Ramaphosa, on the other hand, is talking business with Elon Musk. But it's worth noting that the first people to speak out against France moving against Telegram and its CEO were the journalists of Russia, fearful that government penetration of the secure platform would leave them also vulnerable to state surveillance. I say all of this because I hear calls all the time for regulation of social media, with little regard for the risks of restricting free speech and giving power over it to those who would abuse it. It's worth noting that President Trump wanted to act against social media when he thought it was downplaying his supporters. And President Biden wanted to do it as well when he thought it was feeding Trumpism. Neither did so in the end. But let me also make it clear that I am very much in favor of acting to ensure that we manage dangerous content online. But we need to be reminded how often such measures are used or abused against legitimate speech that should be protected. Such measures, if done carelessly, can do more harm than good. What is it, we must ask, precisely that we want to restrict on social media? What is it that doesn't deserve the protection of free speech? It usually comes down to two concepts: disinformation and hate speech. But both of these have hazy and disputed definitions. And outside of extreme cases, there are no clear lines between information, mistaken information, and disinformation, nor between abuse, offensiveness, and hate speech. So in a number of African countries, we are seeing the new laws against online disinformation used primarily against journalists, because you can label what they do as disinformation quite easily. Or you can label it, might be offensive, but it quickly gets labeled hate speech, crosses the line into unprotected speech. I prefer to talk about dangerous speech. What we have to target is speech that presents clear and present danger, and leave the rest alone. If we are to prevent a negative impact on free speech and protected speech, then we need to target only that which will cause harm. Let me wrap up by saying what may seem obvious but is worth repeating. Freedom of expression is important not because we like to be free to say what we like. I mean, we do. Nobody liked it more than Franz Auerbach. But it's important because it's the most fundamental part of our democracy and our economy. It is the right that gives us the space and the power to pursue all our other rights. For what is the right to health or housing if we are not able to speak out, to demand and protect it? It's also often forgotten how important the free flow of information is to the effective running of our economy. And particularly important in the South African context. The right to hold strong and divergent, to hold and express strong and divergent, even uncomfortable views, is the most powerful tool we have to tackle the crucial issue of inequality. Act against free expression. The first voices to be silenced will be those making uncomfortable demands for greater equality. So as we work towards managing social media, minimizing the potential for damage, we need to ensure we don't do it at the cost of its positive side, that it can continue to give voice to and empower people who seldom had the rights and the freedom under traditional media. We need to be reminded that despite the power of the internet, all the indicators are, all the metrics are showing us that globally free speech is in decline. We don't know how France would have operated under these conditions. We know that he was passionate about free expression, equally passionate about the need to stop hate speech and the need for civil discourse. He would have hated the vitriol, harassment, doxing and trolling that pollute the internet. Maybe at the end, the only thing we know for sure is that he would not have been silent. He would tackle dangerous speech, and he would continue to use whatever means were available to make his voice heard above this clamor. Thank you.
Okay, Anton has agreed to take questions, so if there are people who would like to ask, please put up your hands. Yes, there's one over there. Two, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Australia yesterday announced that they're going to introduce a bill to ban, I think, social media for under 16s. And I'm wondering what your opinion is of that. I know, the premise behind it is to protect young people.
No, my view is that the evidence is that social media can do serious damage, serious harm, serious mental health damage to young people. So action does need to be taken to manage that. A total ban for under 16-year-olds makes me raise my eyebrows, because I think that will encourage, it's like banning dacha. It will encourage the use. So I'm unsure about that measure, but I'm certainly in favor of us finding ways to address those issues.
Good, thanks. Thanks very much for that interesting talk, very topical at the moment. I was just wondering, I wasn't completely clear on what your personal thoughts were on whether social media platforms should indeed police themselves. Because if you look at Mark Zuckerberg recently, his testimony in Congress, where he was challenged, he actually admitted that the White House had brought an enormous amount of pressure to bear on him, and he succumbed to that pressure and he expressed regret, rightly or wrongly, but he did. Elon Musk, on the other hand, argues that he bought Twitter with free speech in mind. His argument is he's a free speech absolutist. So should they actually be policing themselves, and doesn't that give rise to to self-censorship, which ultimately is censorship, whichever way you want to look at it?
So what I'm trying to indicate is that self-regulation is better, or industry regulation is better, than putting it in the hands of those who might abuse it. And that's the example, I think, of our press council, for example. We would prefer to police ourselves than to, what you don't want to do is give a politician the power to decide what's information, what's disinformation. We are best if we, in our industry, make those decisions ourselves. Now, my experience is that industry doesn't do it until they're forced, because it's expensive and it's difficult. And the truth is, when it's a mechanism to avoid it being done by politicians or through the courts, then we self-regulate. And my view is that it's perfect. It remains imperfect. There's no doubt it leaves gaps. but it's preferable. So I think the Facebook system, I've tried to point out how impossible it is, but that they're doing it or doing it as best they can, if that's what they're doing, then it's at least a start. You clearly don't think so.
I think there are enormous problems with that. And particularly with Section 230. I mean, the issue is, a lot of countries wouldn't apply that. Obviously, it's a United States issue. But should the CEOs of companies and companies themselves be responsible for the content? I mean, is the post office responsible for what people send in letters, or the telephone networks responsible for what people say on the phone or send on messages?
No, they're not. But we're seeing a difference here between media and a platform like the telephone. So yes, they argue that it's like the telephone, they're not responsible. But it's nonsense, because we know they're making decisions on content all the time, delegated to their algorithms, but they're instructing them how to make those decisions. So they're making content decisions all the time, in secret. So certainly what I think is that a key element is removing Section 230. Because if Elon Musk is risking prosecution because of allowing hate speech, for example, on the internet, I promise you he'll stop it. If Zuckerberg is risking prosecution, I promise you he'll find a solution quite quickly, a more effective solution.
Or he'll censor speech that is claimed to be hate speech because some group or other doesn't like it, like a government or I think it's problematic.
Okay, let me answer that and then we must move on. Yeah. That's why I argue for an industry a standard rather than an internal one. Definitely an industry one would give some protection against that, and it has to be transparent. So transparency is absolutely critical to that.
Carolyn.
Okay, great. Hi, I really like what you said, that when there's censorship, it often
Can you give her the microphone? Hi, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. So I like what you said, that when there's censorship, it often deals with issues of equality. And I think issues of equality or censorship aren't just found on social media. I think they're also in organizations and also in schools and also in NGOs. So I think it's very important that there are people who are whistleblowers. And I think there are also people who it's important that people stand up for issues on equality or gender equality. And often you have people who really like censorship because they don't like people challenging their views or opinions. And I'd like you to talk on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, what you point to is important. You know, censorship used to mean, arresting people who said things we didn't like. Now we find the tools used against people who say things that one doesn't like are many and different and more subtle and less apparent, but often as serious. So that's why it's important that we develop a culture of free speech across our society, not something that sits in the Constitution, but a realization of how it's important. I'm talking about how it's important to our economy and our democracy and to the issue of inequality. But it's important to the operation of all sorts of institutions and structures in every possible way. You're quite right about that.
So there's self-selection in question time. The person with the microphone seems to be the one who's going to talk. Okay.
It's handed to me, I didn't take it. Thanks, Anton. First, thanks for a very thought-provoking talk. And you said the starting point of the problem we face in the digital era compared to previous new technologies was one of accountability, and the fact that the platforms have become unaccountable in many respects. It seems to me that the other and perhaps more significant form of accountability historically has been the law, such as laws of defamation and liability that hold people responsible, even for hate speech. Could we not make some progress by requiring that all posts on certain kinds of media have to be identifiable? In other words, that you can't post anonymously. It seems to me that a big part of the problem that we face on social media and on WhatsApp groups and other things is that people post things anonymously, and therefore there's no way of holding them accountable for what they say, and that if they were forced to be identifiable, we would be able to do better. Clearly, there's some downside to that, amongst others. If you are a revolutionary in a dictatorship, or a whistleblower in a company, you need to find other vehicles. But there are other vehicles as well, and I wonder whether the downside of people being able to say anything, any disinformation, any hate speech, and hide behind anonymity, it doesn't outweigh the benefits that could be gained. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
You're quite right that being able to be anonymous allows much more abuse and lack of accountability from the person who makes the post. But anonymity has its place in our society, and an important place. I mean, France used pseudonyms all the time because he held positions at schools and in teachers' organizations where he couldn't write some of the things he was saying, so he used pseudonyms. And in fact, in the book, there's one story of when the Rand Daily Mail accidentally used his real name. And he got hauled before a school disciplinary committee and got fined 100 Rand. And the Rand Daily Mail sent him a check for the 100 Rand and an apology. But the point is, he needed anonymity to say some things that he felt needed to be said. So we have to find a way to deal with that problem. We can't, I agree with you, we can't just let it be a free-for-all. So for example, so in our country, as in many countries, if you post something, you are responsible for it. You can be sued or charged under South African law for stuff you put on social media. But if you're anonymous, what do? One way might be that if the platform has accountability, then the state can say there's a breach of the law there, and therefore we're going to court to get a warrant for that information. That's one possibility. It has its complications, but these are the things we need to feel out and find ways through. But just to say it can't be anonymous would be disastrous for some. There's no question.
Thanks very much for a absolutely highly subtle inputs and nuanced inputs. I wonder if it's possible to segue to the role of social media in a war context. Because, there are situations like Gaza, where over 150 journalists have been seemingly targeted, and stations like Al Jazeera have been banned. And my sense is that social media takes on a very specific role in those kinds of contexts. Could you give a bit of an overview of that kind of situation and the role of social media?
Thank you. It's an interesting and important question. What social media has meant is that citizens, ordinary people, in a war situation, have voice, can show the world what is happening. we all know how difficult war reporting is. And how in fact you can't do it effectively unless you're with one side or another. Non-embeddedness is almost impossible. And certainly, I mean, the Gaza is a very particular example where journalists are unable to go in except under very controlled circumstances, and many journalists have been killed. Shocking amount of journalists have been killed. But we see material from Gaza all the time, and that's because ordinary people can use their phones and show us. So that, I think, has become extraordinarily important in all conflicts for us getting a better sense of the impact it's having on the ground for citizens. But it contains huge risks because it opens the door to fakery, to AI, deep fakes, and what we're certainly seeing in all of the conflicts at the moment, Ukraine and others, is that both sides are making extensive use of social media manipulation as part of their war effort. I hope that illustrates both its value and its value and its danger, depending on whose hands it's in. That lady was trying to speak earlier.
Yeah, thank you. My question is on AI versus personal information. I have a sense of feeling that there is no privacy anymore. And also, what is happening with this? What's happening in the world from Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks, and what have you, and these proxy wars that are happening. If you look at what is going on, how information goes, it's very questionable because it looks like even if you are in your own private home, you are not safe. The information is out. So I just wanted to find out where we're going with this AI versus personal information. Because even if you Google it or open your emails, there's a lot of strange things that come through and that you don't want. You don't need them.
There's no question that privacy, we hardly have any privacy anymore. There's no question, although there's new legislation to try and preserve elements of it, there's no question, as I said, that Facebook has maybe 20,000 data points on each of us. They know how we spend our money. They know where we are. Unless you take active and extensive steps to prevent them getting that information. And that probably means not being on social media or not using a cell phone. We know that the surveillance and the data that's collected through our use of social media is an extraordinary invasion of our privacy that is deeply problematic, and that we are grappling with how to manage that. But as I said, when investigative journalists are hunting down a crook, it's a fantastic tool. You know, we had a guy out from the BBC last year, I think it was, or the year before, at our African Investigative Journalism Conference. And his job is just to do internet searches for BBC people. And he was a hilarious guy. And he said, okay, someone in this room give me their phone number. And journalists know what that means, so they said, everyone was silent. So I was in the chair, so I said, okay, I'll give you mine. 5 minutes later, I so deeply regretted it. Because it took me 5 minutes to find my family, my address, my bank. He just came up with all this information in minutes with highly skilled search stuff. So for journalists, it's a fantastic tool. And so he told stories of how a journalist would be saying, I'm trying to find this crook in Nigeria. And he would go down and he'd say, he's not in Nigeria. He's in London. And it would take him 10 minutes. But of course, it has enormous... But let me tell you something else. At the end of that session, someone said, so how do we protect ourselves? And he said, well, when you go to meet a source, it's no good turning your phone off or taking the battery out. Leave your phone at home. And that tells you the extent of the issue and how difficult it is to deal with.
Okay, you can put your phones back on. Can I call on Mo Williams, who's going to thank Anton?
Thank you, Jessica. And very, very warm thanks to you, Anton, for a scintillating, searching, and really thought-provoking and topical talk. Thank you also for paying such a wonderful tribute to France, who I had the pleasure of knowing through this community. A man of real integrity, as you said, a literary man, a poet and a scholar, and in the old-fashioned Renaissance sense, a complete and accomplished gentleman. And I think you've shown us how the whole trajectory of media experience has changed. In France's day, censorship was very crude. As we know, they would obstruct your publications in the press, they would try to lock you up, there were various really harsh measures for silencing you. Whereas now the whole landscape has changed. And I think you traced that for us again very vividly. And when you began to speak of the ubiquity of the internet, I was thinking particularly with this audience in mind of a wonderful scene in a novel by the contemporary American novelist Nathan Englander about a rabbi in a yeshiva. And he desperately wants to find a student in a hidden yeshiva somewhere in Jerusalem. And of course, he's forbidden access to all the media. So through various sneaky underhand dealings, he inveigles one of his students into coming and sitting at a computer in the yeshiva library and tracing the IP address of this particular yeshiva. And the rabbi says, how are you doing this? This is amazing. And the student says, the internet is everywhere. And the rabbi thinks, oi, he's going to say like God. And then the student says, like the air. And the rabbi is able to heave an enormous sigh of relief. But more seriously, I think you've shown us very wonderfully the ambiguity of social media. Their strengths in giving a voice to people who would otherwise be silenced, and at the same time, the danger of the internet, its capacity for doing what is really dangerous. Not only what might be offensive to you or me, perhaps in a very personal way, but what will have really destructive social consequences. And it takes me back actually to the 1980s and the 90s, where Jean Baudrillard, the French sociologist, was writing about simulacrum and simulation, and the way in which the world of the media actually becomes more real and more powerful than the physical world that we inhabit. And I think you've shown us the fundamental importance of accountability, of holding ourselves accountable, and of trying to navigate this public space in which a small number of exceptionally wealthy people hold a disproportionate amount of power. I think you've also shown us how difficult it is to achieve that sort of accountability while upholding the kinds of liberal values that we would want to preserve. So in closing, I want to thank you for speaking with such insight and with such nuance in a world in which so much media speech is simply shouting, people abusing one another, contradicting one another, noise and no listening. I think this evening you had a really attentive audience, and we all really appreciated the opportunity of learning from you. So now it's my pleasure to invite Margaret to come up with a small gift and to present you with some books that were written by Franz.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Let me give back to you.
Thank you, Merle. And now we're going to have tea. Okay. Okay, out that way. Okay, thanks,
Was that a rhetoric?